In 1981, in the attic of a small terraced house in Sheffield, the center of the climbing community in the UK, Rab Carrington made the first sleeping bag to bear his name. More than 40 years later, the people at Rab are still crafting rugged, high-performance clothing and equipment for the mountains, the kind of gear that becomes a staple in your kit that you'd rather repair than replace. Rab are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business and expand access to the outdoors. They're committed to preserving our mountain playgrounds for future generations because they know that the mountains are our meeting place. Last summer, after finishing season 1, the 1990s, an old memory popped into my head of looking in a library that had a bunch of old climbing magazines. That library was owned by Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School, which was founded in 1965 right here in Lander, Wyoming. My memory turned out to be correct, and now the bulk of my research is done in that library. At first I snuck in, then I sweet-talked the ladies at the desk, and finally I reached out to Knowles to see if they would be interested in partnering up. And because they have an interest in history, as well as fostering a love for our wilderness and public lands, they agreed. Thank goodness. I'm just too old to be sneaking into libraries. Knowles, dedicated to developing leaders. This episode is brought to you by Tension Climbing, where you can use code WRITTEN15 for 15% off of select items, and by Power Company Climbing, where you can use the code STONE for 20% off of most training plans, products, and books. When I was trying to come up with who my dream guest would be for a conversation about Alan Watts and who he is both as a person and as a climber, there was one name that came to mind. And as the universe sometimes works, the same day that I came to this conclusion, I saw that Bill Ramsey was in my town on a climbing trip. So I sent him a text, and a couple of days later, he came over to chat. And it was exactly what I hoped it would be. Now, if you aren't already familiar with Bill, he's a legend himself who's still pushing his own limits and dedicating himself to climbing. And if you listened to the previous episode, Alan Watts Sets Off a Chain Reaction, you already know that Bill and Alan had an interesting connection since birth and essentially learned to climb together. But beyond that, I knew Bill was the perfect person to talk to because he's a philosophy professor and a deep thinker. And Alan Watts did more than just bolt some hard climbs. He did more than just develop an area. He was more than just a climber. And in this conversation, Bill makes some connections that I was trying to make but hadn't quite connected yet. Before we get into it, a couple of reminders. Next week, we are off for the holidays, but the patrons, the Secret Stoners Club, are getting a bonus episode, a recording of Alan Watts and Russ Clune in conversation about the early days of sport climbing. Patrons are also automatically entered into a drawing for one of several Chain Reaction 40 Years of Sport Climbing posters signed by Alan Watts that Alan was kind enough to send over to us. You can join the Secret Stoners Club for free at patreon.com/Secret Stoners Club, or the link is right there in the show notes. And last, because I know you're listening, Alan, thank you. We appreciate everything you've done, everything you've given to climbing. All right, let's get into it. Bill Ramsey, welcome to Written in Stone.
Good to be here.
Your name came up in the first season. I think in our first episodes, we had Katie Brown on early,
right.
And your contributions to the Red can't be overlooked. So you came up early last season. I'm glad to have you here for the beginning of season 2.
Great, I really enjoyed last season.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Am I right that you and Alan Watts were born in the same hospital?
Yes, that's correct. He's about 3 hours older than me. And what's interesting is both our fathers climbed together. And Alan's mom knew my mom, and Madras, where we grew up, didn't actually have a hospital. So we had to drive to Prineville, 25 miles away, for the hospital, for the maternity ward. But yeah, we were there in the maternity ward together, and I'm sure our fathers looked at each other, looked at them, looked at us, and said, "I wonder if they're ever going to climb together."
Yeah.
And it was pretty wild.
When did the climbing bug sort of catch the two of you?
So Alan had been climbing with his father, and I had been climbing with my father, but not really going very hard prior to roughly, I think Alan started climbing at Smith in 1975. And then I believe I went out there with him sometime around 1976, 1977. And then when I got into it, he was already really into it, but I got into it 100%, just jumped right in. And we were going out to Smith Rock after high school every weekend, basically, and we just got completely absorbed. So for me, it was right around 1977.
And then you guys climbed together all through
Yeah,
high
we climbed
school
together while we were in high school, and then in 1978, we graduated from high school. Alan wasn't sure if he was going to go to college, but I had been to Eugene at the University of Oregon, and I discovered that there's this climbing area in the town, right in the middle of town, called the Skinner Butte Columns. And it had these low-angle cracks. Some of them were actually quite difficult. Some of them had been nailed, so there were pin scars you were jamming in. But I thought, man, for training for climbing, this is an amazing place. So I told Alan about that, and he thought, that actually sounds pretty good. So he and I wound up going to Eugene in the fall of 1978 and wound up spending a tremendous amount of time at the Skinner Butte Columns. There were no climbing gyms at that time. So this was the closest thing to a gym that we had. And we kind of quickly did all the things that were the straightforward climbs, the column faces and the cracks. That same year, Alan Lester showed up at Eugene, and then another really, really strong climber named Chris Jones.
Boulder.
Right? Boulder,
Yeah.
exactly. He had actually just survived a 150-foot ground fall in Yosemite and more or less staggered away from that. But when he got out of the hospital, he started coming to the Skinner Butte Columns. And so we were training there. And Alan and I had been to Yosemite. Our graduation present from high school, our parents gave us some money and a car to go there for a week. And so we, at that time, kind of could see what was happening in Yosemite. And we just viewed the columns as a sort of training center for us. And he really got into it. You see, at that time, almost exclusively hard climbing was all crack climbing.
Right.
There were hard face climbs, but for the most part, the standards were being developed in terms of crack climbing because Yosemite and to some degree Joshua Tree just dominated the Western scene.
Right.
And so to be a good climber meant not necessarily being really strong, but being a very good crack climber, being a very good crack jammer, very good at placing protection. And so that there was this crack climbing zone where we could just train for that. I think really helped us develop. I mean, I know it helped Alan become an incredibly good thin crack climber. And it also, because we were running out of things to do, we contrived these ridiculous sort of elimination things, one-handed things.
Sure.
There was even a contrivance scale we went where it's like, I think C1 was, okay, you got to avoid these holds, but C4 was something like you're fighting gravity to keep from leaning into something.
Wow, cool.
But in any event, Alan would do these things there, these column faces, one-handed, and we were climbing in EBs at that time, which are just terrible shoes. But nonetheless, he just developed incredible footwork, standing on these micro edges and doing these one-handed descents that were probably at the time some of the hardest climbs in the country.
Wow.
They're just silly and they were top ropes, but they were nonetheless how he got really good at jamming and really good at his footwork.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting to me as a coach because, we try to put specific constraints in place to help people improve aspects of their climbing, and it sounds like you all were doing that for fun.
Yeah, for fun and to some degree out of necessity because, of course, you can't change the holds. This
Right,
is an outdoor
right.
area. But we wanted to be doing new things. We wanted to be challenging ourselves, and these were the things that were left to do. So it was pretty cool.
Wow, that's great. I'm curious about Smith. I know it's blasphemous, but I haven't climbed there at all.
Oh, my God.
It's on my list still. But I'm curious, with the crack climbing there, because it's not, granite splitter cracks, was there a lot of face climbing around the cracks? I'm curious.
There were some sort of just straightforward face climbs, but the vast majority of the climbs at the time were still cracks. They weren't great cracks, and a lot of times you would be using footholds, let's say, on the faces.
Right.
But generally speaking, we were doing traditional routes, and the people who had been developing the area, people like Jeff Thomas, were also doing the traditional routes. But what was happening, in my view, was that come around 1979, 1980, 1981, all the really sort of attractive cracks were being climbed, and there wasn't that much left to do. And so, again, crack climbing dominated everything. So when I graduated from college in 1982, I think a lot of us, Alan Lester went to Colorado, Chris Jones went to Colorado, I went to Southern California, where there was a lot of crack climbing, and I wanted to go to grad school. But Alan was committed to staying at Smith Rock, and I can remember telling him at the time, I think at that time he was probably climbing stronger than the rest of us. And I'm like, you're just an amazingly talented and strong climber, but you're just going to waste away in this backwater that nobody knows anything about.
Yeah.
And that's really increasingly climbed out, and there's not going to be anything left for you to do here. You should leave with us. But I mean, Alan's love for Smith Rock was just so incredible and so profound that he decided to stay. But it was the case that increasingly the cracks were all climbed out, and that's when he started looking at these supposedly blank faces and recognized that there were actual holds on it, and that's when the sport changed.
Yeah, well, I think that's fascinating, and I'd love to get a sense of Alan as a person as well. And we think of him now as this person with this forward-thinking vision that sort of pushed American climbing forward when it was floundering a little. But was that always evident?
I think
was he
Alan,
that way?
all of us were somewhat competitive with one another, but in a, I think, very healthy and friendly way.
Mm-hmm.
And we all just wanted to be good climbers. And we were doing our best to move up in the sort of through the grades. We had this enormous inferiority complex with regard to California and Yosemite. Everybody thinks there was this hostility, but we completely 100% idolized people like Backer and Kalk
Right.
and everything that was happening there. And we just wanted to try to get as good as they were. And so Alan was driven and he was motivated. And so we all were just working to get better. We didn't know really anything about training. We just knew that you get better by doing a bunch of climbing. But he's also been somewhat, I think, creative. And I think Alan's an incredibly intelligent person. And I think part of what happened was he just happened to have the vision to see this potential that a lot of us didn't see at Smith Rock.
Mm-hmm.
And to some degree, he was forced into seeing that potential when we ran out of cracks. But part of it was also just, I think he was really, really, really committed to that place. And his love for that place started manifesting itself in the climbing. For a long time, I said what's distinctive about Alan at that time period was that as he was moving up and becoming one of the top climbers in the country, one thing that was unique with Alan, I thought, was that whereas other people, maybe Todd Skinner to some degree, or a lot of the other top climbers were really sort of trying to do their best to develop themselves, to make a reputation for themselves, and to move up through the grades to promote themselves in various ways. And Alan had that to some degree, but I often said what was distinctive about Alan was that he seemed to be more committed to developing Smith Rock. That seemed to be his agenda. So whereas other people were trying to develop and promote themselves, he was trying to develop and promote Smith Rock to put it on the map.
Yeah.
But now looking back, I kind of think maybe that's the wrong way to look at things because it implies a false dichotomy. It suggests that, you can ask this question, well, what was Alan more committed to? Developing himself or developing Smith Rock? And I'm not so sure you can make that distinction.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that because I have a note here that says dichotomy, selfless versus selfish with a question mark.
Yeah.
Because it seems like maybe he was developing Smith in the way that he was for his own sake as well, which you could see as a selfish thing.
I would say his identity was so tightly intertwined with the development of Smith Rock that to ask this question, which one was more important to him, his own development or the development of Smith, I think that's a bad question. I think that it's really hard to suppose or assume that those things are as distinct as you might assume they are.
Yeah.
He, to some degree, was Smith Rock, and Smith Rock was him. And the promotion of those two things were so closely intertwined with one another that I think it's a mistake to assume that you can make that distinction. I think that when he bolted to Bolt, he probably knew he wasn't going to do the first ascent of it.
Yeah, that seemed to be the sense that I got from him when we talked about that route.
Yeah, but then I think when J-Bay did it and Smith Rock became the home of America's first 514, I think in Alan's mind, that was a feather in the cap of his climbing career.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think those two things are so closely bound up together, his climbing, Smith Rock, that it's a mistake to try to drive a wedge between those two.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm glad you got there because I was trending in that direction, but hadn't fully gotten to his identity being intertwined with it.
I think I've seen this in other places too, I mean, you think about Randy Lovett up at Clark Mountain, and he prepared Jumbo Love. He knew he wasn't going to do that, but he knew this was a special place, and he was thinking about the future. Well, you have these times when someone's love for a place is so strong and so tied up with their identity as a climber that you get this tremendous amount of devotion and industry taking place, and you wind up within a really, really special place.
I'm curious from your own history, was there any of that with you and the Red?
Certainly for me, the Red was kind of a savior because it's what brought me back into climbing.
Yeah.
I mean, I had taken the job at Notre Dame, and in the Midwest, it's just cornfields basically. And so the first time I saw the walls at the Red River Gorge, I was blown away by how impressive they were and how much, in my mind, these represented just the ideal of rock climbing, these waves of overhanging sandstone with holds everywhere. And so it, to me, is what got me back into climbing and helped define my return to climbing. And so, it became very much my identity for the 90s and those areas, because after a while I was going down every single weekend, and my climbing life, my social life, everything was caught up with the Red. So to some degree, that was taking place. Only in my case, I had so many other people who were participating as well in the development. I mean, I was lucky insofar as I kind of had climbed everything, and then I was forced to start, trying to put up routes of my own. But there were so many other people who were very magnanimous and generous while they were there.
Yeah.
But no, without a doubt, it's a very, very, very special place in my heart.
Do you think there was some catalyst in those early days at Smith Rock leading into the 80s when it got, when Alan really sort of took control there? Was there some catalyst other than just running out of cracks? I'm curious. And the reason I asked that is because I know in 79, I think it was 79, you and Chris Jones did Monkey Face. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, we did the first free ascent of Monkey Face.
And I think there were some rappel-placed bolts on that route. Is that right?
I mean, I don't know. I can't I didn't place the bolts on the route because people had been working it before I got to that project. I think the bolts might have been placed on rappel, but I think a couple of them were also placed with hooks.
Yeah.
But there was certainly no drive to do things ground up or anything like that. I mean, Alan and I had done a couple of direct starts to some climbs. We did Zebra Direct, and we did King Kong when we were in high school. This was in 79 too. And we just wrapped down and placed the bolts and didn't think anything of it. We top roped it. These routes all had long traverses into them. And so it was, let's just do a direct start. And so we placed those bolts on rappel, and maybe a couple people frowned on it, but we just didn't really think that much of it. So to some degree, I think running out of cracks was a catalyst, but we knew with Monkey Face and some other things that none of these faces have holds on them, and that might be the future. And so, like I said, when Alan started rappelling down these things and seeing, there actually are a lot more holds than I thought, that was when, to him at least, being a good climber shifted away from being a good crack climber and in the direction of being a good face climber with strong fingers and good footwork and the ability just to hang on for a long time. So I think to some degree that same thing was happening in other areas of the country. I know Christian Griffiths was sort of promoting the same kind of style. I know Todd Skinner was as well. I think for him, he just wanted to be a really, really good climber, and what it meant to be a good climber as the 80s wore on transitioned from being a good crack climber to just being what we think of today as being a good phase climber.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you all were just, placing a few bolts here and there on rappel and not really thinking much of it, because for historical reasons, I was trying to compare like the Gunks with Smith. Like here were these two places. The Gunks became this sort of stronghold of tradition, even though it was on the leading edge of things leading into the 80s. But then Smith, which, didn't have much of a name at that point, took the other route. So
Yeah.
I was curious how the ethics evolved in those two places.
I believe that one of the things that contributed to Smith's development was the fact that there was not this strict, hardcore old guard that would stamp down and try to put an end to what we were doing. Yeah, there were people like Jeff Thomas, for example, from the Gunks, who I think frowned on bolts on rappel. He probably frowned more on the use of chalk. It's always been interesting to me that that's not as controversial as some of the other things that were controversial. But he frowned on it. But you know what? He thought, I've had my time. This is the next generation. And he deserves credit for being sufficiently open-minded to allow or to not really give Alan a hard time about pushing things in the direction that he pushed things. I think also Jeff understood that Smith rock the quality of the rock is not that great. If you're going to do a quality route, you probably do need to rappel down and clean it off. And if you're rappelling down to clean it off, then why does it make sense to also place bolts as well?
Sure.
And so I think also part of it was the nature of the rock. But a lot of it was it wasn't like El Dorado. It wasn't like the Gunks. It wasn't like a lot of areas where there was this old school traditional outlook towards every bolt has to be placed ground up. And that freed up Alan to sort of develop this new style. I also think that it's interesting. You tell people today what was truly controversial at that time, and when you tell them what was controversial, they can't believe you, because what was controversial wasn't so much about bolting. In some places it was, but not
more
really
the
out
hang
there.
dogging.
It was hang dogging.
Yeah.
And that in Yosemite and in California, the attitude was anytime you fall, you cannot hang there and check things out and work on the moves. You have to lower to the ground. That also was an ethic that did not exist in Oregon. And I think that also freed things up. I mean, we at the Skinner Butte columns would top rope things, and then, we'd fall off. We'd just hang on top rope and work things out. And we wouldn't think anything of it.
Right.
And it wasn't until we started climbing in Joshua Tree in Yosemite where we found out that people think, no, you need to lower to the ground every time you thought. And we just thought that was the dumbest thing we'd ever heard. That was so bizarre. But, I mean, to be fair, part of it was motivated by the tradition of crack climbing.
Yeah.
And so if you're trying to do a hard crack climb, if you're trying to do something like, I don't know, Tales of Power, there's not that much to figure out.
Right.
The hard part is just keeping going and placing the gear. And to some degree, in California, at least in some spots, it was thought to be okay to do something that we thought of as cheating, which was to leave the rope in place.
Right. The yo-yoing
strategy. Right. We thought that was bizarre. So like when Alan did the East Face of Monkey Face, he always removed all the gear and would have to place the gear on lead. So, yeah, it's funny. I remember when the great debate took place in 1986, I think, or 87 with the American Alpine Club. I gave Alan a bunch of talking points to use in this discussion about hang dogging because it just struck me as such a silly mindset. But I mean, obviously, if you're going to transition from crack climbing to phase climbing, and you're going to basically be doing hard boulder problems on a rope, then yeah, you got to hang around and figure these moves out. And so you tell people today that this hang dogging thing was controversial, they just don't believe it. But even I still hear people today. I think I heard somebody sort of describe in a podcast that what Alan and everybody was doing was cheating, and it's just really funny. It's really
wild.
Odd. But I think sometime around 1987, 1988. Ron Kauk came to Smith Rock and thought, man,
Yep.
this is fun. And he'd been hanging out with Wolfgang in Europe and thought, this is actually a good way to
Mm-hmm.
go. And once Kaut came over to the dark side,
Yeah.
it was all over except for the shouting.
Yeah, absolutely. One more thing I just want to sort of point out about Alan and ask you about is his like demeanor and personality. We sort of have this caricature in our heads of driven, innovative people as being this like head down, charged through
Right.
everything, super selfish kind of a person. And Alan doesn't come across that way at all. He comes across as humble and kind and almost appreciative even of people who stole his roots from him back in the day. You know,
Right.
grateful that they happened when they happened is how he put it to me. And
Alan is very introspective, and I think something a lot of people don't know. He actually has a really, really good sense of humor. He's one of the funniest people I know. And he is magnanimous, and he actually, everything you just said about him is true.
Yeah.
He's very thoughtful, and he's very considerate. But at the same time, you can be that way and driven. And
Yeah,
Alan was
absolutely.
driven and motivated. So for me, he was a perfect climbing partner because we always had great times together. And even though he was competitive, he was very supportive as well. And so, yeah, he was somebody who had the perfect combination, I think, of not taking himself too seriously, having a good time, being supportive of others, but at the same time, sort of a little bit competitive and trying to do his best to become one of the best. And I think that's exactly what you see in most top athletes.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Let's get into some Smith details. I know you said to me that you thought the place was climbed out and you left sometime around 1983. But I think Alan told me that you suggested the name for Watts Tots, which is what we sort of accept as the first real sport climb in America.
I may have. I don't remember that, but it was next to another climb called Tater Tots, and that was one of the first 510s he and I had done together.
Right.
And I said, yeah, Watts Tots would be a good one. That's now considered to be the first, I guess, sport climb because his bolts were placed on rappel and he hang-dogged on it. But I see what he was doing basically, and at that time, I was kind of getting out of climbing because I shouldn't say I was getting out of climbing. I was climbing the cracks in Southern California. And I was really getting pretty heavily into a PhD program, and I was realizing that it was going to be a lot more work than I had appreciated, but that's okay because I also was very much interested in philosophy and a career in academia. And I would come home, however, in the mid '80s in Madras, and I would sometimes go climbing with Alan, and we would go out to Smith Rock. And the transformation that was taking place at that time, number one, Alan was just obviously becoming a climber that was way beyond anything I could imagine at that time. But then we would go out to Smith Rocks and there wouldn't be 2 or 3 other climbers out there like it was in the 70s. We go out to Smith Rock and there would be 50, 60, 70, 80 other climbers out there.
Oh, wow.
And then some of the very best climbers in the world were coming there. And so I would start to see this transformation taking place. And then it was also, I think one of the main things that really changed the sport, maybe people don't appreciate, was in terms of technological developments, was actually the power drill. Because that's when you started to see this explosion of climbs going up. I mean, prior to the power drill, every bolt had to be placed by hand, which is an enormous amount of work. Once the power drill came into the canyon, you could put up a route in a day, no problem. And so there was just this explosion of new routes going up as well. So it was really kind of shocking and incredible to see the transformation taking place at Smith. As I would come home, I couldn't do any of these climbs, but I thought, man, there's this new style of climbing. It's this thing called sport climbing. You got these nice bolts to fall on. You don't have to worry about dying. Gee, it looks like a lot of fun. And so when I got back into it, and the fortunate thing was that the Red just offered me an opportunity to do that sort of thing. 6, 7, 8 years later.
Yeah, I introduced Alan at our keynote series for the Climbers Festival last year, and I take my like introduction job for the keynote speakers really seriously, and I do a bunch of research and I write these things about people and we tend to want to romanticize everything and find meaning in everything,
Right.
So when I talked about him establishing Watts Tots, I had created this meaning in my head of Watts Tots, and it was like all the rest of the sport climbs are Alan's children.
Right.
And and I gave this theory, and then I talked to him after, and he's like, well, actually, it's just because it was right next to a route called Tater Tots, and Bill suggested Watts Tots, and that just stuck,
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, we look at all this through the lens of hindsight.
Yeah, absolutely.
From seeing the impact now of these things.
Yeah.
And you see these as really significant in a sense that really stood out because you're asking yourself the question, when did it all start? When did all this stuff that happened later begin?
Mm-hmm.
But of course, at the time, you don't see things that way.
Right.
At the time, Alan's like, oh, I want to climb something other than cracks, these crappy cracks that are left, and here's this face, and I guess I need to clean it off, but I can get to the top, and I can wrap down, and I'll place some bolts, and I'll do that. And oh, yeah, I think this is the hardest thing I've done yet. And now there's this other thing over here. And that's going to be a hard thing, and it'll help me become a better climber. And so I'll do this other thing.
Yeah.
And it's only, looking back that you see all this as having an impact that at the time you're completely blind to.
Yeah.
I think at some point in the 80s, Alan looked around, saw, Scott Franklin had moved there, Jim Carn had moved there, the top climbers in the world were coming there.
Mm-hmm.
They were putting up routes, and Smith Rock was, in all conversations, the top climbing area in the country at that time. And I think then he realized, oh, something special's happening here. Something really different, something really distinctive and unique is happening here. And I think that's when he said, oh, this is going to be important.
I'm going to continue my romanticizing and, looking through hindsight here. Because, I mean, that's part of what this podcast is about, really, is like, I could go just have Alan on the episode about chain reaction, but I would rather tell the story in a larger than life romanticized way, because I appreciate these tales that I came into climbing with, and they helped me connect with it and love it and build it up to be this mega thing in my brain that now is just a massive part of my life, So I want to tell those tales.
Yeah, well, I don't want to discredit Alan because I do think
No.
It took a tremendous amount of vision and perseverance and innovation to do what he was doing. And also, like I said, he had to put up with a lot of crap, not so much locally at Smith, but when he would travel to other areas. He would go to Yosemite, and, Jeff Smoot's written about this, but he'd go to Yosemite, and he was doing the hardest stuff there pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And people would say, well, yeah, but you're a cheater, you're hangdogging.
Mm-hmm.
And they would vandalize his car, do things like that. And so he had to put up with a lot of stuff from other areas and attitudes from other people. Not so much the top climbers. People saw him as diametrically opposed to Backer in terms of style they were, but the reality is they were friends.
Totally.
And they had a tremendous amount of respect for each other. And Backer viewed Alan as a really, really good climber, and Alan viewed Backer as a really, really good climber. They just disagreed on style. So I think it was other individuals who were kind of really pushing against Alan and giving him a hard time. And so it took some guts, and it took some character to stay with the path that he saw as his vision for Smith Rock. And it's the path that, because he took that route, climbing is what it is today. And a lot of that came from chain reaction, because I'm not sure if Smith Rock would have exploded and sport climbing would have taken over as rapidly as it did had it not been for the international interest in Smith Rock.
Yeah.
And that international interest was almost entirely driven by that Mountain magazine cover photo by Heinz Zach of Alan on chain reaction. Stunningly beautiful shot.
Yeah.
Iconic, and people all over the world saw it, and they were like, "Whoa, what is that? That's really quite impressive."
That photo's been imitated thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Yeah,
right there on your wall,
all over the place, and that's why my romanticizing this thing kicks into full gear, because here's this thing, this route that's you couldn't imagine a cooler looking route right in the middle of where Alan is building this, sport climbing mecca that's changing American climbing, and all the best climbers are coming there. And it's called Chain Reaction, which, it's certainly created after the fact. I know Alan didn't sit there and think, I'm going to call this Chain Reaction because it's going to create a chain reaction. But it's this beautiful, coalescence of things.
It was an ignition event that created a chain reaction, without a doubt. A little bit of the irony is that when you look at that climb, it's actually somewhat different than the style of Smith Rock, and in much more sort of foretelling of the kind of steep climbing that would take over sport climbing down the road. Because so much of Smith Rock's on pretty vertical faces. There's some steeper stuff in the Agua Gully, but generally speaking, it's technical climbing that's not terribly overhanging compared to what later people like Boone and others would do in American Fork. But nonetheless, it was anticipatory in the sense that here is this incredible arête, and the climber's back is to the ground because it's so steep.
Yeah.
And it just foretold, in a way, the future of what sport climbing was going to be.
Did you see the route after it was bolted and, done by Alan? Did you see it in person before you saw the photo? Which happened first?
I think I saw the photo first. I knew the arête, but the thought that there would be a climb going up it, I'm like, no way. Are you kidding? Were you just going to pinch that corner? Because I didn't know about there being any holds on it.
Right.
And so I'd seen the arête. I knew where the arête was. I knew where it was located. And the fact that Alan had actually climbed it, I'm just like, oh my God. And then later when I did climb it, it's like, oh yeah, there actually are pretty good holds on this thing. And it's not that terrible.
Yeah.
But yeah, I saw it after it was climbed, and I saw the draws hanging, and I'm like, geez, that looks incredible. That's just amazing. It's funny, I don't know if Alan told you the story about it, but at that time, again, getting back to the ethics issue, it was thought to be really important to hang the draws on lead.
Right. I remember that.
Yeah. So he had the draws. So we didn't know what we were doing. And a lot of times we would never warm up. We would just show up at the cliff and like, well, you got to climb your project fresh.
Yeah.
So he would try it, right off the bat, showing up at Smith Rock. And of course he wasn't warmed up. And a lot of times his first go, he'd probably be, he'd be at 70% or something. So he failed, but he thought, oh, I'll try it again. But I got to get the draws off somehow. So what I'll do is he just, when he actually climbed it, he unclipped the draw from the bolt, clipped it onto his harness, and then took it off his harness and clipped it back on and then clipped in. So he was spending, I don't know how much time he was spending at each individual bolt, hanging out, unclipping and clipping the draw back on, because he thought that was the best style. That was the only acceptable style. So it's pretty hilarious.
It's amazing these rules we just put on ourselves.
Yeah. You tell people today, well, there's this thing that was once called pink pointing, and people are like, what do you mean? And it's like, well, it's basically what we all do now when draws are fixed, and you have fixed draws now in so many climbs. But it used to be thought that you had to actually hang the draws and have them on your harness on every legitimate ascent. It's completely crazy.
Was there a time like after you had started climbing again and gotten stronger and stronger and you were spending time in the red, did you ever return to Smith to try any of those harder things?
Oh, yes. As I was sort of moving up through the grades at the red, my family still lived in Central Oregon. And of course, as a college professor, I had the summers off. So I thought, well, why am I spending my summers out here? You can't really climb at the red. I know, I'll go back to Smith. And I remember Alan sent me the first edition of his guidebook, and I was thumbing through it, and I just started really looking forward and anticipating going back to Smith. So I spent my summers from roughly 1993 to 98, 99 at Smith Rock. And it turns out that in the summertime, if you get up early enough, you can climb in the Agua Gully, because as the lower canyon heats up, you get a wind that comes up through there. So it was in the middle of the summers that I did things like Badman and White Wedding and all those climbs in the Agua Gully. I did most of the climbs in the Agua Gully that were there in the summertime. And that's also how I kind of improved my climbing, was actually at Smith Rock. So it was great returning to this place I loved that I'd known as a kid, and actually being good enough now to actually start climbing some of these harder routes there. So yeah, I spent my summers back at Smith and living in Bend for the most part during the 90s. That's where I did my first 514 in 1998 when I did Badman.
Oh, nice. Yeah. It's interesting because you sort of came into my consciousness through the red, of
Right.
course. And I didn't know about your history in Smith until many, many years later. So it's cool to hear that you went back and did some of those routes that were like defining American climbing, in
Yeah,
the
it was
80s and
awesome.
early 90s.
I wish I'd been able to climb at other times of the year, so I could have done some of the other classics like to Bolt and some of those other things. But just having that opportunity to go back and climb and take other people there. I took Dave Hume there when
Mm,
Dave did Just Do It in
just do
3
it.
tries.
Yeah.
Um, that was one of those summer trips. And so, yeah, it was actually really nice to return in that way. And I still love going back there. It's still such a special place.
Yeah. I'm curious how you feel about like looking at what Alan's done there, at the, love he gets now for it. And it's an interesting feeling for me when I see things that I was a part of years ago really getting their respect, you know?
Right.
Um, it's almost pride,
Sure.
even though it's not me, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that is pride, but it's definitely I think Alan's gotten the love that he deserves.
I hope so, because sometimes I wonder, right? I mean, I talk to a lot of young climbers and I'll mention Alan Watts and they don't know who I'm talking about.
Sure.
And I think what happens is so many of the climbers today learn to climb in a gym,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in a gym, someone's paid to set the routes. And so when they go outside, they think, oh, yeah, it's just kind of like in the gym, someone's paid to do this for my benefit. No, that's not what happens. There's a tremendous amount of work and money and effort that goes into preparing these climbs. And I don't feel like people appreciate it quite enough. I think we should be doing more of what you're doing, which is celebrating that commitment and that devotion that in the past people have. And today I see people developing routes, and there's just enormous amounts of work and energy that go into it. And I think we should be doing more to celebrate those folks and give them our love and appreciation. And if you played some role in that, I think pride's a fully appropriate thing to feel about that. I'm very proud of the routes I did, both at Smith and at the Red. It's a wonderful feeling to have one of the best climbers in the world come through and do your
Yeah.
climb and say, man, this was a really, really enjoyable
Yeah.
experience. This was a really great climb. That's just a great feeling to have made that kind of contribution. I can't imagine what it's like to have made that kind of contribution at the level that Alan has.
Right.
And again, with some other people like Randy Levitt and BJ and others, where they're not only developing particular routes, but they're developing entire zones, entire climbing areas.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of commitment and that kind of devotion, we owe them a huge debt of gratitude, I believe. And
Yeah.
we need to be doing more, I think, celebrating what they contributed. And in the case of Alan, by the way, you think about, well, he's the father of sport climbing. He's often designated that way, and I think it's fully deserved. But you got to realize another major contribution to climbing that's changed the sport is climbing gyms.
Mm-hmm.
And there again, Alan was at the forefront when he was working as president of the American Entreprise. They were building many of the very, very first climbing gyms in the country.
Yeah.
And developing fingerboards and developing climbing holds. So right there again, he was at the forefront and kind of leading the way for this other way in which the sport has dramatically changed. So in terms of the contribution that he's made to American rock climbing, it's I think you can't give him enough praise and enough love.
Yeah, I agree. Question that I'll insert a little earlier. You mentioned he sent you a guidebook to Smith, and I think you and Alan together wrote the first guidebook. Is that right, to Smith?
No, I did not. He did that entirely on his own, and he had been commissioned to do it. And there again, the same kind of perfection and excellence that he devoted to developing Smith Rock went into the guidebook. In the latest edition, I mentioned in the foreword that there was this time, sometime in the mid-'80s when I was back in Oregon, and I went to his house, and in his living room, he had a sheet up on the wall, and a projector with a picture of one of the walls at Smith Rock. And I could see on the sheet these very faint little lines and these little corners and things that had been drawn. And I'm like, Alan, what the hell is this all about? And he's like, well, I'm doing these drawings for the new guidebook. I've done about 40 and I've got about 60 more to go. And I'm just like, what? Why don't you just take a picture?
Yeah.
And I could kind of tell he was a little bit annoyed, with me. He's like, well, of course, dummy, a picture won't show what needs to be shown. It won't capture the key aspects of the route. It won't capture the arêtes where the holds are. So no, you got to do it with drawings, obviously. And I really shouldn't have been surprised because that same sort of devotion to sort of presenting Smith Rock to the world that I'd seen at Smith Rock in his development of climbs was now the same thing taking place in the guidebook. A lot of times people ask me, well, I have a lot of friends who've written guidebooks and they say, well, what's a model? Like, look at Alan's guidebook. That's a model for a world-class guidebook. And I still think that today.
Wow. Well, Bill, I love this. I'm glad to get to talk to you about Alan. Last season, I talked to Adam Andra a little about Just Do It and about Alan, and I think he is a real gift to the future generations of climbing because he's always pushing the history forward, and he's very appreciative of the developers and wants to get them involved in the the videos that he makes and all of that.
And I'm kind of glad to see now for a long time, he would go out to Smith, but he really wasn't promoting himself in any kind of way. But now I see he kind of is, and I'm really glad to see that. I think that's really deserved, and I really think that more people need to understand his kind of contribution that he made. And I think that it's wonderful that he's going out now and talking to younger people and talking to climbers and just becoming much more prominent in that way. I think that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I also appreciate your contributions.
Thanks.
My first 514 was Transworld Depravity, your route. So, I owe you a debt there. And I think it's just so important that we continue to recognize where things come from. I don't think we have to romanticize the history to the point of it holding us back. And I think that's this conversation is a great example of that. Like, you all were idolizing these climbers in California, but not necessarily following their ethical, their ethical path. And I think that's really important. Find the good things that move us forward and leave the rest of it behind.
Exactly.
So I appreciate your perspective here, and thanks so much for sitting down and talking with me.
Well, thanks. I like the opportunity to talk about these things. I don't want to pretend like, there's a tendency of older folks to be like, well, back in the day. And let me just say, I am completely impressed by what modern climbers are doing and their same sort of spirit. And I think a lot of that is because they do appreciate what people like Alan did and the contribution they made. So I think that not only do we need to look back in terms of the importance of that contribution, but also as a model for moving things forward. The norm and the tradition is change.
Yeah.
It's progression.
Yeah.
And it's transformation. That's why I feel like, okay, people are doing things differently now than what I used to do, but how many times have I had to evolve a little bit to sort of be able to still climb?
Yeah.
Quite a bit, 6 decades of climbing, basically.
Well, if you didn't, you'd still be doing laps on slabby cracks.
Exactly. So thanks.
Cool.
All
right.
Super fun.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. Our patrons, the Secret Stoners Club, got a bonus episode last week. They're getting another next week, and they're automatically entered into drawings for giveaways we'll have all season. So go join the club. And remember, This show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review. Check out all of our sponsors, Rab, Tension Climbing, and Knowles, and tell everyone you know at the crag, at the gym, in that internet forum where everyone is shouting into the void, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. I hope you're all winding down, getting ready for the holiday. I am doing the same. I just shipped out all of the pre-orders of my book, Adapt, Lessons Learned Climbing 10513s. So that is out of the way, which is a really great feeling because I didn't think they were going to be here until today, but they got here early. So nice to have that checked off the list. First things first here. New rock stars, Fount, Alexander, and Neil, and a new legend, Blake Green. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. I appreciate the support. I put a ton of work into this thing, so I'm glad you all are getting something out of this, enough that it's worth supporting. Thank you. The day after, maybe 2 days after, the Alan Watts episode came out, the Chain Reaction episode, Alan listened and he sent me a very, very nice email. The guy is just a class act. And, I have the Chain Reaction poster hanging just above my desk, and it makes it more meaningful with each interaction. That's just the kind of guy he is. I can see, I know he and Bill Ramsey are still good friends. They had dinner shortly after I recorded this episode with Bill, and Bill let the cat out of the bag that I had talked to him about Alan and Chain Reaction. So it's easy to see why a guy like that, and a guy like Bill, for that matter, are worth being friends with for a lifetime. I'm 50 years old now. That's something I've been thinking about. I don't really have any lifetime friends, but I do have some friends who I cherish and who've been my friend for a very, very long time. But that leads me right into thinking about, Alan sent me some of these posters. I've got 5 of them, I believe, to give away, signed by him. And it occurs to me that I want these posters to go to someone who they mean something to, someone who's going to cherish it in the same way that I do the one I've got hanging on my wall. So I'm going to do something different with this giveaway. I know I've already posted in the Patreon about how I'm doing the giveaway, but I'm going to change that. I'm going to delete that post, actually, and I'm going to put up a new post today. And to be entered into the giveaway, you have to like the post, then you're automatically entered. If you comment and try to sell me on why you should get that poster, I will give extra weight to your name. I don't know how much yet. Maybe this isn't fair. I don't know. You can also comment and tell me why it's not fair. I'm open to that. But I want these to go to people who care. And I may end up doing this with a lot of the giveaways this season, because some of them are going to be books and things that people might already have or might not be interested in. So I want to make sure these things go to people who will use them, will cherish them. So, new post is up in the Patreon. Go there, like it. If you want to be entered, leave a comment trying to sell me if you think you deserve this poster. I'm still going to give more weight to rock stars and legends, our monetary supporters, if they like and comment on this post. But if your comment is a really great one, you'll get extra weight as well. Still working this out in my head, obviously. Next week, we are off for the holidays. However, we aren't off for the holidays because I have at least one bonus episode for you, the Secret Stoners, that will go through the patron feed into the Apple subscribers. It's a conversation with Russ Clune and Alan Watts, talking about the early days of sport climbing. It's just the two of them in conversation and talking to a crowd of folks who assembled and wanted to hear them talk at the International Climbers Festival this past summer. So you'll get that. And also, in my research for the Alan Watts episode, I came across a passage in Pat Ament's book, Wizards of Rock, A History of Free Climbing in North America, I think it's called. I don't have it in front of me. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. And I've used this book quite a bit for reference. And there's a great passage in there from Chris Jones, who did the first free ascent of Monkey Face with Bill Ramsey, which helped kick off the free climbing boom in Smith and the idea that hangdogging is okay. And I want to give that to you all to read, and I'm going to read it as a podcast episode for you. So I reached out to Pat Ament and asked him if it would be okay if I republished it for you, and he agreed with some hesitation. I probably wasn't super clear in my first message, and he's like, I can't imagine what you're going to do with this and if it's going to help it or hurt it. And I'm like, I'm not going to change anything. I just want to put this story out there because I think it's a really fascinating example of someone wrestling with their own ethics at a pivotal time in rock climbing history. So you're going to get definitely the Russ and Alan conversation, probably the Pat Ament book section where Chris Jones talks about Monkey Face. And then we'll be back after the new year with a regularly scheduled episode, the story of a young, brash Brit determined to be the best, whose determination may have just set off one of the strongest runs of pushing free climbing standards we've ever seen. All right. Happy holidays to all of you. I'll talk to you again soon.